Flatwater, 5 short fishing stories. Nebraska Society of Fly Fishermen, Ishmael, the one that got away. The Confession, Mermaid, 2021 by Stephen Koenig. All rights reserved. This is a work of fiction. Published by Sodtown Books. For Carolyn. Fish Story Number 1, Nebraska Society of Fly Fishermen. It began as a simple idea that would lead to the loss of my friends, my career, and my wife of 25 years. Then, with my name slandered, and my health and faith all but spent, I found myself at the brink of my very being. The idea occurred at a Nebraska lake, where I stopped to rest. I observed a gentleman, thigh-deep in water, casting a fly rod. He wore hip waders, a fishing vest, a sunburnt fedora, and wrap-around sunglasses. The man appeared very content, and I thought I recognized him. A thought flashed through my mind. Fly fishing possesses the power to heal the wounds of life and restore one's soul. This idea ignited a spirit of warmth through my entire body. I was at a crossroads and looked for an outlet from my sedentary life. My job as a private investigator required that I sit in a surveillance van, hour upon hour, day upon day, shadowing insurance claimants with alleged physical injuries. It also required sitting and driving between witness interviews and attorney-client meetings. Then, I would travel to my home office, sit in front of a computer, type reports, review videos, and perform other desk-bound casework. I would usually close out my day by falling asleep in front of the television, cradling an ice cream bowl or can of beer. And so this nugget of an idea to take up fly fishing came to pass. I shared the idea with my wife, who suggested asking a few friends to join me in my endeavor. I conceded the point and talked to my close friends, describing it as a club with no officers, dues, bylaws, or bank accounts. I just wanted to go fly fishing. It is unclear how it happened, but word spread in the community about a scheduled meeting. 13 men and 1 woman assembled in my garage. I led the discussion and suggested a name for the group, the Nebraska Society of Fly Fishermen. I also submitted my idea of a loose-knit organization sans typical club bureaucracy. Immediately my idea began to unravel. Many voiced their dislike for the proposed name of the club, and they suggested others. Some in attendance felt that only serious fly fishermen should be allowed to join. One group suggested it be a social club, where members would drink beer and tell fishing stories. An older gentleman suggested a literary group, recommending that the applicants compose a 10,000-word essay on the art of fly fishing as part of their application. There would also be mandatory reading assignments on the subject. My pastor suggested an interfaith religious group that studied parables and psalms with fishing themes in hopes it would evangelize the masses. As we are all fishers of men. Another suggested an anti-alcohol pro-marijuana club for those in need of inner healing. This man also proposed using barbless hooks and suggested members release all caught fish back to the healing waters. The discussion continued to break down over opinions on topics ranging from collecting dues, electing officers, and meeting locations. The meeting disbanded after a 2-hour agitating and fruitless discussion. As they walked out, groups discussed establishing their own fly fishing clubs. My plan to form a small band of fly fishing brothers failed. To my surprise, my closest friends held a sincere disdain for the idea. I thought, well, that didn't pan out, but as they say, that would not be the end of it. My thoughts of fly fishing continued. I watched fly fishing programs on television and scrutinized YouTube videos that taught the art of fly casting. I browsed fly fishing supplies at a specialty chain store and began making discreet online purchases of flies, leaders, and other gear. I purchased a fly rod at the estate sale of a man who once resided in Idaho. Made of split bamboo, it weighed 4 3/4 ounces and came from the Gulf of Tonkin. Such vintage fly rods sold for $800 on eBay. I bargained with the deceased rod owner's nephew-in-law and settled on $3. I purchased a wicker fishing creel, the Fly Fishing Bible, and a collection of multicolored popper flies, guaranteed to work well on panfish like bluegill and perch. I learned to tie a blood knot. I practiced fly casting for hours in my backyard and became proficient at false casts, steeple casts, and roll casts. My neighbor mocked my efforts and called out from his Friday night deck parties, "Are the fish biting? And catching anything yet, Sherlock?" I heard through the grapevine of the formation of local fly fishing clubs. One club sponsored the first annual Nebraska fly fishing tournament. Other fly fishing groups included an association of aerial crop dusters, a collection of rabbis that certified kosher meat at a nearby beef packing plant, and a troop of sheriff's deputies who called themselves the Panfish Posse. Members sported fly fishing club t-shirts, bumper stickers, and beer koozies. The state's leading newspaper broke the story. The Nebraska Society of Fly Fishermen, known as the NSFF, was a serious criminal syndicate. The paper's inside source put me at the epicenter of the entire enterprise. The NSFF, under the auspices of a fly fishing club, was involved in serious illegal activities, including laundering drug money, fundraising scams aimed at the elderly, sales of unlicensed medical marijuana, an escort business run from a bait shop, and crop insurance fraud. The fly fishing club members included tax cheats, religious leaders, habitual traffic offenders, pharmacists, and farmers. The paper intimated that the FBI had placed our group, mainly me, under close surveillance for several months. The state's attorney general mumbled, no comment, when asked about the investigation. My arrest was imminent, and groups lined up to file a civil suit against the NSFF. They and their attorneys would attempt to tap into my private investigative agency's $5 million professional liability policy. I had not even yet attempted fly fishing on an actual body of water. The paper tried to cast me as a dark figure with connections to the criminal element and the seedy underbelly of society. But that was far from the truth. Along with conducting thousands of hours of surveillance on insurance fraud cases in a dozen different states, I also conducted investigative work for the leading law firms in Nebraska. I led the startup of the state's Private Investigator Association and served as its first president. I wrote articles on covert surveillance for a private investigator magazine. My clients knew me as an experienced investigator with a solid reputation. My work helped many. I worked cases for those falsely accused of serious crimes, tracked down runaway teenagers, and located absconded sex offenders. However, clients quit calling once the NSFF story broke in the newspaper. I gained more weight and slipped deeper into despair. I no longer slept in bed with my wife as I needed an upright sleeping position to breathe better, a position that only the living room recliner provided. As the situation worsened and my stress increased, my appetite for food grew to monumental proportions. My inner gloom and food indulgences seemed to shake my wife from her lethargy. She began race walking and gained a beginner's yellow belt in Taekwondo. She ate salads with no dressing. I gorged on donuts and cookies and consumed copious amounts of pizza, carb-loaded pasta, and pastries. My daughters, now in their 20s, joined their mother. They all trained for and then ran in a local 5-kilometer race. They shared online yoga videos and healthy food recipes with bean sprouts and kale. My wife wrote in her private journal daily and went to a tanning bed every week. She began taking French language lessons. She took an online paralegal certification course and obtained a job at a law firm specializing in real estate transactions. Her income doubled. She prepared to take the state real estate exam. I had gained 30 pounds. My friends and pastor all but deserted me. The newspaper spoke of lawsuits against the NSFF. A member of one fly fishing group incurred an eye injury when a fly hook tore his retina while making a false cast. Another group wrecked their club van after it struck a deer and rolled into a riverbed. A group of female activists filed suit after feeling victimized by the NSFF's gender-specific terms, fisherman and fishermen. The newspaper continued to write stories that again cited their confidential informant. The source now spoke of NSFF mob connections in Kansas City. I received calls from reporters nationwide wanting me to comment on the allegations. As my life spiraled downward, my wife became ever more empowered. Along with shedding pounds, she began experimenting with diverse hair colors and brilliant shades of fingernail polish. I conducted an internal investigation that found she had reviewed online dating sites and made queries about breast augmentation surgery. She concealed a secret cell phone under the seat of her just-leased fire-engine red Mustang convertible. I was now taking prescription drugs for high blood pressure, hypertension, and high cholesterol. Walking to the mailbox or putting on my shoes caused shortness of breath. I paid my neighbor to mow my lawn. She, a 70-year-old widow woman, used a push mower and hauled away my lawn clippings. Watching her work left me exhausted. The months dragged on. A law firm gathered the various fly fishing groups to sue the NSFF and me personally. My company, a non-corporate sole proprietorship, was tied to the lawsuit. Finally, the case landed in the Buffalo County, Nebraska District Court. I chose a trial by a judge instead of a jury of my peers, per my sister's advice, who served as my lawyer. She agreed to work pro bono. The plaintiff's attorney had represented prior clients in national class action lawsuits. The lawyer was tall with a smooth, tanned face and slick-backed hair. He stood at his table in the courtroom with his arms behind his back and struck a pose. A pretty paralegal carried his briefcase. I thought of my wife, also a pretty paralegal. The judge entered the courtroom. His face was tan, but his complexion was sun-dappled and ruddy. He reminded me of my father, a farmer with a ruddy, sun-soaked complexion. The judge wore eyeglasses with one dark lens and one clear lens. Opening statements began with the attorney for the plaintiffs making a summary of his case in chief. He used big legal words and made grandiose gestures with his arms as he spoke. My sister, brief and to the point, made her opening statement. Her physical movements and bearing matched the judge, or maybe she seemed that way, as she moved like our father, who reminded me of the judge. The trial began. The slick lawyer and his blonde assistant moved efficiently. They ushered in witnesses who testified about injuries each sustained. Their witnesses explained how said injuries were traced back to my fly fishing meeting and club formation. My sister objected when required, and followed up with cross-examinations to clarify the facts of each witness's injury. The plaintiff's witnesses filled up the entire first day of the trial. The judge allowed all the witnesses to have their day in court, as they say. The second day arrived with me as our side's sole witness. I had testified many times as an investigator and knew to let the attorney ask the questions and reply with short, direct answers. The judge sat with his chin in his hand and his eyes closed. At times he opened his eyes to make a quick note on a legal pad, then returned to his stoic pose. The plaintiff's attorney grilled me with questions on his cross-examination. I controlled my emotions and focused on my sister. At the end of the questioning, the judge needed to instruct me twice to step down. In his closing, the attorney for the plaintiffs portrayed me as a man of suspect reputation, employed in a dubious profession. In a high voice, he pounded his table and exhorted, "My clients are all solid citizens and good people from Nebraska. These fine people from our state have been injured, and a judgment for these plaintiffs is the by God right thing to do." The attorney took a deep breath and then spoke in a serious tone. "The defendant carries professional liability insurance, and such coverage may help alleviate the sincere financial damages suffered by my clients. Albeit their personal injuries will leave a stain that no amount of money could ever truly erase." My sister made her closing remarks, listing the weaknesses in each witness's testimony. The judge appeared to take note of her presentation. The judge then suggested that we break for lunch, stating, "The trial will conclude upon our return." My sister and I went to a runza restaurant. I ordered 2 cheese runzas, a large order of onion rings, and an extra-large chocolate shake. My sister stared at me from across her salad with looks ranging from pity to outright disgust. "The judge is impossible to read. I would guess he will give us his ruling in 2 to 4 weeks. That is normal." She added, "You should start watching what you eat." I looked out the window. "Don't you think the judge looks a little like our father?" My sister stared back at me. "The newspaper's inside source. You know who it is, don't you?" "Yes," I said. "I know who she is." Everyone stood as the judge took his seat. He looked around the courtroom. "I am prepared to make my ruling from the bench on this matter. I believe I have heard enough." The plaintiff's attorney beamed an arrogant smile, crossed his long legs and ironed his suit with his hand. "Please don't interrupt me until I have finished my ruling," the judge mandated. I looked at my sister. She had no reaction to this surprise from the judge. The judge spoke with controlled intensity and without notes. He began to tear the slick attorney and his clients to shreds. He included the newspaper in his admonishment and the state's attorney general. He made no mention of the FBI. He railed at how this miscarriage of journalistic justice is the likes not seen during his 25 years as a district court judge. He declared that my attorney would be derelict in her duties if she did not advise her client to file an immediate libel suit against the newspaper, and that she should request sincere monetary damages. "The defendant is not a public figure," He too is a citizen of our fine state. The judge continued, the malicious reporting by the newspaper via this so-called unnamed source clearly contained no basis in fact. The attorney for this group of plaintiffs provided this court with no credible evidence of a fly fishing club ever being created by the defendant, nor did one silly meeting constitute such a thing. He asked the court reporter to read back the answer to the final question asked by my sister. The court reporter read my sister's question, "Have you actually ever gone fly fishing?" The court reporter then read my answer. "No, I have not." The judge repeated my answer while glaring at the plaintiff's attorney behind his half-dark, half-clear eyeglasses. "No, I have not." The judge stated that he would research his recourse with an eye toward potential legal sanctions. The attorney representing the group of plaintiffs sat red-faced, then stood and began to speak. The judge silenced him, cited the attorney for contempt, and fined him $1,000, adding, "I warned you not to interrupt me. One more interruption, counselor, and you will be jailed." My sister sat stone-faced. She had written pages of copious notes during the trial. I looked to see what she had written after the judge's ruling. I saw a single dollar sign in large, bold print. One morning, a week or so later, I woke from my recliner, still in the previous day's clothes. I walked into the kitchen and overheard my wife whispering into her cell phone, saying something about leasing a townhome. Upon seeing me, she let go of her phone and resumed painting her toenails. "Where are you going, Norman?" I slipped on a pair of slip-on shoes, filled a thermos with coffee, and said, "I'm going fly fishing." I paused at the door and turned. I took a deep breath and said, "Goodbye, Evelyn." I found my split bamboo fly rod with a chartreuse-colored popper fly attached. I did not take my fly box or my wicker fishing creel. I would not be coming back. On that sunny spring morning, I returned to the lake of my fly fishing inspiration. I laid my fly rod on a picnic table near the water and poured a cup of coffee. I sat at the table facing the lake and put my head into my hands. I felt the sun's rays soak into the back of my neck. The cottonwoods creaked and swayed in the cool breeze like old rocking chairs on a front porch. I contemplated my only valid option as bluegills jumped and blooped in their spawning beds. I felt a warm hand on my shoulder and a voice spoke, "Are the fish biting?" I looked up in hopes of seeing the spirit of my father come to rescue me from my earthbound purgatory and lead me to the merciful world that lies beyond. I blinked my eyes. The man wore hip waders and a vest adorned with fishing flies. He also wore eyeglasses with one dark lens and one clear lens. I last saw this man in a black robe. The judge smiled behind his ruddy face and walked down the shore. He stripped out some line and made a perfect cast. He waded into the thigh-deep water and cast again. Turning to me, he donned the wraparound shades that covered his glasses and readjusted his fedora. It was him, the man I saw when the fly-fishing impulse breathed its first breath. I looked at the sun. An inner feeling of warmth began to radiate through my mind and body. It was partly spiritual, but I felt a physical flood of warm energy explode through my cells. The warmth spread from my shoulders and melted into my arms and out my fingertips. I stood and looked back at the figure down the shoreline as he made art with his fly rod. I gripped my fly rod, walked to the water's edge, and made a simple roll cast, the same roll cast I made 1,000 times over in my backyard. Line and leader unfolded, and the fly landed peacefully on the water. Fly fishing at long last. Fish story number 2. Ishmael. I gathered my fly rod and canvas creel and walked to the water's edge. Life had left me feeling hollow and feverish. Nearby, a young girl dug in the sand. Her parents stood watch from camp chairs near an Airstream trailer. I caught spawning bluegills and tossed them back. They blooped and swam off, and the little girl giggled and clapped. Dark clouds gathered, and she raced to the trailer. I was about to haul gear when I saw a white swirl in the water. What the hell? I tied on a dragonfly. The wind met my casts, and the line died upon itself. Clouds darkened, and lightning flashed. One last cast. The wind inhaled, and my cast of line, leader, and fly fell into the white swirl. One breath later, the fly was jerked under the water. Thunder clapped, and the wind blew. The fight was on. The hooked fish careened beneath the water's surface as the cottonwoods danced like hula girls. My fevered mind strained for answers to impossible questions. leaving me taut and frayed. The rainless storm crested, and dry lightning streaked across a bedeviled sky. In my mind, a wire snapped as the fight with the white fish faded. It slid to me across the sand. It was translucent, with neon blue, green, and yellow lines, a state record. The little girl ran to my side. Her mouth wide, she stared down at the fish. Hands on her knees, she spoke. "What is his name?" "His name? I don't know, I guess I will call him." "Shmael," I said, releasing the hook and fly. "Ishmael," she breathed. "I like that name." She beamed a smile of the innocent. I recalled fishing with my daughters and regretted not doing more. I looked at the airstream as the parents waved. I turned back to see her bare feet, frog-walking to the shoreline. She gently released Ishmael into the water. My state record albino bluegill was gone. She smiled, clapped, and said, "I gotta go." She skipped back to her parents. The storm passed and my fever was gone. I went home. Fish story number 3, the one that got away. Ted Killebrew was driving east through Nebraska on Interstate 80, which crisscrossed the belly of the state from west to east and back again. He was hauling quartzite boulders from a quarry near his ranch in Douglas, Wyoming. Ted, a native of Wyoming, had not spent much time in Nebraska save for speeding through the state. The Killebrew Rocking K Ranch ran 300 head of mixed-breed mother cows. They calved their cows in the fall and late spring, avoiding the harsh Wyoming winters. Trucking decorative landscaping rocks was a good way to supplement a rancher's income during poor cattle prices. During the slower summer months, Ted hauled rock to the quarry's clients throughout the High Plains area. Ted made his first stop in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where he dropped landscaping boulders at a new convenience store that sat along the interstate. He then drove on to Lincoln, Nebraska, leaving the remainder a landscaping business. It was a long day. Ted spent the night at a motel on the outskirts of Lincoln. The Motel 6 had a bar on one side of the building and an adult bookstore on the other. Ted went to the bar after checking into the motel. The Windjammer bar's air conditioner was trying to keep up. Ted sat at the bar and made small talk with the locals and others staying at the motel. Nebraska's hot and humid July weather put a somber mood over the bar. Ted watched as an older man held a frosted mug of beer to his forehead before he guzzled half the drink in one gulp. Another man asked for a red one. The bartender poured homemade tomato juice from a mason jar into a frosted mug and topped it off with tap beer. She slid the mug and salt shaker to the customer. The man shook salt into the beer and took a big pull on the drink. Red froth clung to his thick mustache, which he wiped clean with the back of his arm. A mounted bluegill fish hung above the bar. Ted, a fly fisherman, asked the bartender about the fish. The bartender was named Dawn, and she said that her father, the former bar owner, caught the state record fish. At least he claimed it was a state record, but he never officially had it weighed and certified. Dwight Holcomb's name would not be in the state record book. Dwight spent the rest of his retirement trying to catch a certifiable state record, bluegill, but it did not happen. When Ted returned to his room, the hot weather had him turning up the air conditioner. He called his wife, Lurleen, back at the ranch. Lurleen and the kids spent the day checking windmills and digging out a patch of pesky musk thistles at their Shadow Ridge pasture. Ted said he would head out early in the morning. The following day, Ted made it about 120 miles before mechanical troubles delayed his trip. He limped the truck to the Gibbon, Nebraska exit on Interstate 80. Ted called his boss at the quarry, who approved the truck stop at the Gibbon exit to handle the repairs. The part to repair the truck would take a day to get delivered. Ted wondered if he would have to sleep in his truck. The Kenworth didn't have a sleeper, but he had slept in the truck's cab before. The clerk at the truck stop said there was a motel on the other side of the exit, but added, "It's pretty sketchy." The clerk also mumbled something about bed bugs. Ted thought that wasn't a ringing endorsement for the place. Ted was considering his options when he noticed that across the road was the Windmill State Recreation Area. The clerk relayed that the park had an antique 1880 standard windmill that used to pump water for steam locomotives. He added that the state park catered to campers and fishermen. 5 lakes were on the site, and one was stocked with trout. Ted knew all about trout fishing, but he guessed fishing for cutthroat trout on the Wild Green River in Wyoming would be different from fishing for Nebraska trout in a little pond. Ted asked the truck stop's clerk about the trout lake, saying he carried a fly rod with him in his truck. The clerk's name tag read, Clyde, assistant manager. Fly rod. I've never used one of those things. Most people around here use normal fishing rods and reels. I use a cane pole. I get myself in my fishing chair, toss out my line and bobber with a fat worm on the hook, crack open a Pabst Blue Ribbon, and pray the fish don't bother me. What are the trout biting on? The clerk spit chewing tobacco into a paper cup. Most people use worms or night crawlers. But you don't want to fish for trout, mister. Not when you can win some cash if you catch old Big Boy. Big Boy? Yes, sir. Windmills, Lake Number 1 is the lake right across the road. It's the big lake of the 5. It's right over there. The clerk pointed again across the road. There's a giant largemouth bass somewhere out there. It's been caught a few times, but nobody can seem to land it. Cabela's is offering a $10,000 reward for anyone who can catch that big fella. How big is he? He's every bit of a state record, which now stands at 10 pounds and 11 ounces. The record fish was caught in a sandpit near Columbus, Nebraska, back in 1965. I remember seeing a picture of it in the Omaha World Herald. Heck, you probably weren't even born yet. How big is the one out there? Ted pointed his thumb over his shoulder toward the state rec area. Well, according to those that have had Big Boy on the hook for a short time, he's all of 14 pounds. He's a monster. What did the guys who hooked Big Boy use for bait? The clerk chuckled. No one is talking. But the word on the street is one guy used a dough ball flavored with Tabasco sauce. Again, just a rumor. Ted asked a final question. How would you know if you caught this here, Big Boy, or if it was some other fish? Oh, there's not another fish as big as old Big Boy out there. Besides that, he's got a big scar on him. And supposedly, he's got at least 3 hooks sticking out the side of him, where people tried to snag him. There ain't another fish like him out there, mister. Ted told the clerk that he might go over and toss a line. He looked over the fishing supplies and equipment the truck stopped carried. There was no fly fishing merchandise. Ted then looked through an upright cooler with styrofoam containers of night crawlers and leeches. He looked into a box of each and watched them wriggling around. Ted was strictly a dry fly fisherman. He couldn't imagine fishing with live bait. Ted bought a one-day Nebraska fishing license from Clyde. He also purchased a tallboy can of Coors beer, a bottle of water, and beef jerky. Ted put the beer, water, and jerky in his cooler. Clyde told Ted to cup some ice over the beer, saying it was okay to use ice from the soda pop dispenser. Ted thought that was decent of the clerk, and he topped off the little lunchbox cooler with ice. Ted then talked to the chief mechanic. He learned that the part for his truck might come in overnight, and they would get on it right away. Ted grabbed his fly rod and canvas fishing creel from the truck. He looked inside the creel, where he had stuffed a box of flies. Most of the flies he tied himself. It was something to do on long winter nights. His grandfather purchased the ranch in the late 1800s. Despite some rough financial patches, the Killebrew family managed to hang on to it. Ted doubted his kids would be interested in ranch life as a profession. The Killebrew family was not famous. They did have a shirt-tail relative, Harmon Killebrew, who had been a Major League Baseball player. Ted also played baseball. His .360 batting average and an outfielder's good arm caught the attention of college recruiters. Ted was offered a scholarship to play baseball at a small college in Colorado, but while working cattle at the end of his senior year in high school, he tore out his knee. That killed the scholarship and any college plans. He still dreamed of playing baseball in the major leagues. Ted walked across the highway to the Windmill State Park area. A conservation officer sat in a small shed at the entrance, checking vehicles for mandatory park stickers. Ted said his semi-truck was parked across the road. He showed the officer his one-day Nebraska fishing license. They talked about trout and Big Boy. Ted headed to Lake Number 2 to try to catch a trout. It started to cool down by late afternoon, but the air was still humid. It was more humid than the arid Wyoming climate. A shade tree and a decent breeze made things tolerable. Ted figured he'd sleep in the truck that night. He didn't want to pay money for a crappy motel room with bedbugs for roommates. Ted opened his box of flies. He looked to see what kind of flies were buzzing around, hoping to find a similar one he had tied. Ted pulled out a fly he had named Slugger. Slugger was an old standby that he went to often. It was made of hair from his horse, Harmon. It wasn't one you would ever find in the Cabela's catalog, but the fly had caught many fish. Slugger didn't appeal to the trout in the rec area lake. Ted tried a few more flies, finally settling on a popper fly he purchased at the estate sale of an older fly fisherman. The fly worked, and Ted landed a couple of rainbow trout. They looked nice and were barely keeper size. He thought of putting them over ice in his cooler and taking them back to Wyoming. Ted released the fish back into the water. Ted walked back to the truck stop to call his wife. On his way back, he looked over toward Lake Number 1. Clyde, the truck stop clerk, was sitting by the big lake, a long cane pole stuck in the air. Clyde used a stick shaped like a Y to hold the cane pole upright. A red and white bobber bounced not far from the shore. Ted guessed Clyde had a can of beer in the folding chair's cup holder. Ted called his wife. They talked of musk thistles and how the mother cow with the number 77 ear tag looked like she had hoof rot. Ted said he would get her treated when he got back home. He said he might spend the night in his truck as the local lodging wasn't worth the money. Lurleen said she didn't like him sleeping at an interstate truck stop. Ted said he'd be careful. He didn't mention anything about fishing. Ted returned to the trout lake. Clyde was still in his chair when Ted walked by Lake Number 1. He looked like he was sleeping. Ted caught a few more trout and tossed them back. He then began to think about Big Boy, the alleged state record base. It would be nice to catch a state record fish. Every fisherman considers that at some point. The $10,000 reward money would also come in handy. Ted thought of his ranch and how they managed just to get by. During the school year, Lurleen worked as a para at the local high school. She dealt with kids with learning challenges. Lurleen was patient, and she had a big heart. Ted then again looked back toward Lake Number 1. Ted walked over to the big lake and noticed that Clyde had left the area. He also saw the stick shaped like a Y lying on the ground and empty cans of Pabst Blue Ribbon in a trash barrel. Ted found a spot in the shade, guessing the heat kept most campers away. Ted did not like crowds. He preferred the solitary work of ranching and trucking. Once a year he attended a Colorado Rockies baseball game. Crowds made him edgy. So he and Lurleen would usually move out of their seats to a less crowded area of the ballpark. Ted was not having any luck catching Nebraska fish with his Wyoming flies. He decided to try his slugger fly again. One of his friends described slugger as the ugliest fly he had ever seen. Ted conceded that slugger was one ugly fly. Ted spent the evening tossing slugger out and letting him float. When rummaging for his fly rod, Ted put a Zane Grey paperback in his jeans pocket. While he fished, he read from the book. It was a story about a poor Wyoming rancher fighting cattle rustlers and a local sheriff trying to steal his wife. Now and then, he would pull slugger to shore and then cast it back out onto the lake. He was hopeful he'd catch a fish hungry for Wyoming horsehair. As the evening light faded, he threw the book to the side. The humid air cooled, and he decided to spend the night in the park. Ted held his rod so he would feel any tug at the line. He looked up and saw the Big Dipper. In high school, he wrote a paper about the 7 stars that made up the constellation. There was Alkaid, Mizar, Alioth, Megrez, Phecta, Bubé, and Merak. 3 stars made up the Big Dipper's handle, otherwise known as the Great Bear's tail. The rest made up the Great Bear's hindquarters. Ted fell asleep looking at the rising half-moon and thinking of the stars. He woke to a twitch on his fly rod sometime after 4 o'clock. He tried to remember where he was. Ted saw the truck stop's lights in the distance. He watched a lone vehicle cruise westbound down the interstate. Ted felt another tug on the line. Oh, crap. My rod. As Ted tightened his grip, a severe tug almost yanked the rod from his hand. Ted stood and let loose some line. He let out more line, and then slowed the reel by letting it rub against the heel of his callous hand, something he had done many times before. Ted had caught fair-sized trout in his time, but what he had on now was a big fish. He didn't want to mention the fish's name as that would surely hex the catch. Ted knew in his gut that he had hooked Big Boy. He could not see the fish when it leaped into the night but heard the splash. Ted's heart skipped a beat upon hearing that sound. The slugger horsehair fly was tied using a size 10 nymph hook. Ted doubted such a hook was up to the task of landing this big fish. Ted spent an hour walking back and forth up the shoreline. At one point he could go no further due to a large cottonwood tree. He almost snagged the fly line on one of the tree's low-hanging branches. He worked the fish, letting it run a bit, then slowed it down with a gentle break of his palm on the fly reel. This fish was like nothing he had ever caught. It had power and strength. Ted knew if he pulled too hard, the number 10 hook or the leader would snap. At one point, Ted and the fish each took a break. He glanced back at the Big Dipper, which was now fading as the half-moon slipped to the west. The fish held the line taut, but Ted could tell the fish was tiring. An owl hooted in a nearby tree. Owls were a sign of good luck, and Ted began to think he might just land this fish. Ted doubted it weighed 14 pounds as Clyde, the clerk, had mentioned, but it was more than the 11-pound state record. Back and forth up the shoreline, Ted gently fought the fish. He thought that at any point the leader might snap or the fish would spit out the hook. Ted could feel the fish's strength draining. It tried to make one more run, but he slowed its escape. As the fish's strength seemed to break, Ted slowly pulled in the line and slid the fish to shore. The sun was breaking over the horizon. Ted traced the fish's thick scar with a finger, and he touched the ends of snagged hooks that stuck out from its sides. The fish stared back at Ted as he watched it breathe. The fish slowly faded away and then sucked in its last breath. Ted removed the box of flies from the creel and slid Big Boy into the canvas pouch. The fish's large tail stuck out of the creel. Ted laid back on the prairie grass and rested his eyes. He thought of the fish, his truck, and the work waiting for him back at his ranch. Ted hadn't given one thought about state records or reward money during the entire time he tried to land Big Boy. When he woke an hour later, the sun had climbed higher into the sky. Ted shook himself to remember where he was. There was movement as the early morning crowd fueled trucks and walked in and out of the truck stop. The interstate traffic had picked up, and cars and trucks whizzed by as they headed east and west. Ted then remembered Big Boy. The conservation office at the park would likely have a scale to help him certify the record catch. Ted looked to his left. The fishing creel was gone. He looked to his right. Ted's heart skipped a beat as he climbed to his feet and looked around. He spoke to himself, "Good God." Ted looked, but the fishing creel and his Nebraska state record largemouth bass were nowhere to be found. He then thought of the $10,000 reward money. His fly rod and slugger fly, still hooked to the line, lay on the ground next to his Zane Grey paperback. Ted took a deep breath and shook his head. The part for Ted's truck came in overnight, and the serviceman had the truck about ready to go. Ted grabbed a breakfast sandwich and filled his travel mug with coffee. Clyde, the clerk, was again behind the counter. Ted asked Clyde how he was doing. The clerk didn't seem to remember talking the day prior. Ted waited for the clerk to ask him how his fishing had gone. He almost said something about Big Boy and his fight to land the big fish, and how the fish came up missing. He looked behind him at the line of people waiting to give their money to Clyde. Ted didn't say anything. When Ted got home, he met his wife and kids, who were preparing for supper. Lurleen made a roast with baked potatoes and homegrown green beans. He asked Lurleen if she still had some of her canned tomato juice. Ted opened a mason jar of the juice, poured it into a mug and dumped a can of Coors beer over the top. He then tapped salt into the drink and held it up, explaining to his family, "They call this a red beer." Ted took a drink and wiped red froth from his handlebar mustache. After supper, Ted and Lurleen sat on the front porch. Lurleen made herself a red beer and said it was another reason to can more tomato juice this year. Ted then told Lurleen his fish story, and how his $10,000 Nebraska state record fish somehow got away. Lurleen patted her husband on the shoulder and poured them each another red one. Lurleen was at the family computer a week or so later when she came across the news. The Omaha World-Herald ran a story of how a local truck stop clerk named Clyde, using only a cane pole and a night crawler, caught the Nebraska state record largemouth bass. There was a picture of the clerk holding the fish, and another photo of him holding a $10,000 check from Cabela's. Cabela's also agreed to pay an undisclosed sum for the fish, which they would mount and hang in their store in Kearney, Nebraska. Ted was unsaddling his horse, Harmon, when Lurleen walked into the barn. She was carrying the article and the pictures of the truck stop clerk. He sat on a hay bale, read the story, and looked at the pictures. Ted had a great fish story, but who would believe him now? The article wrote how Nebraskans were happy that a local had caught the state record largemouth. The fish weighed just shy of 13 pounds. Ted thought of the bluegill mount hanging in the bar back in Lincoln, Nebraska. He thought of Dwight, who spent his retirement trying to catch a state record fish but failed to do so. Ted told himself that he would not spend the rest of his life chasing after something he'd likely never catch. He learned long ago you had to let some dreams die. Ted walked out of the barn and looked over his ranch as the sun faded. He thought about how he needed to check the number 77 cow he had treated for foot rot, and he thought of a broken corral post he needed to fix. He then thought of the kids returning to school, and that Lurleen would return to her job as a para. Ted then thought of Big Boy sliding up on the shore. He remembered tracing the fish's big scar with his finger and touching the hook stuck in its side. Ted would wait until he was older. Then, on a hot summer day, while having a frosty mug of red beer, he would tell a story. A fish story, about the one that got away. Fish story number 4. From the novel Barbed Wire Runs Through It. The Confession. Joe overheard his parents one night while drinking beer and talking more than usual. His Uncle Gene and Aunt Maxine, who farmed and ranched west of the church, had stopped by for a visit. They were having a conversation about Father Paul. Father Paul was alleged to have survived life in Nazi-occupied territories in Slovakia and Austria. As the Bauer family came from Austria, the priest mentioned that he had known several Bauers while working at a refugee camp. They also spoke of how Father Paul was an excellent cook and winemaker who liked fishing. They spoke of how diabetes took his left leg, so walking and fishing were now a challenge. They spoke of his gentle nature and how he loved the kids at the parish. And he often had what he called fun days. The ladies of the parish helped Father on winter Sunday afternoons as the kids played games and ate cookies and treats that he'd made. On that last day of April, Father Paul found his favorite fly rod and prepared to visit Meadowlark Lake. Jack and Carol Frost attended St. John's, and after they learned Father Paul was a fisherman, they said he was welcome to fish at their lake any time. He owned around 30 fishing poles but only used one. Father Paul grabbed his split bamboo fly rod and his wicker creel. He also brought a couple of bottles of Dr. Pepper and a bread sack with pinwheel cookies, which he'd made himself. He placed the soda in a small cooler and cracked ice cube trays over the bottles, resting the bag of cookies on top. He loaded his car and drove to Meadowlark Lake. Father Paul parked his car at the north edge of the lake and began to unload his car. He then heard a splash and a yell for help. He dropped his fly rod and moved down the shoreline as fast as possible. Father found a boy sinking below the water's surface. He grabbed the boy's shirt collar and slid him onto the shore. Father Paul tottered on his one good leg, stumbled, and fell on his rump while gasping for air. The boy, whom he soon recognized as Joe Bauer, coughed and gagged water. After putting his sweater on Joe explained that he couldn't swim. "What are you doing here, Joseph?" Father Paul always called him Joseph. Joe said nothing. "It's okay, you get your breath. Then you can help me find my fly rod." Joe took a moment, then wiped the lake water from his hair. The two walked back to Father Paul's vehicle, which fortunately wasn't too far away. Father found where he dropped his fly rod and his wicker creel. "How are you feeling? Are you okay? Do you want me to take you home?" Joe said he was feeling better. He was wet and his eyes were watery. Father Paul didn't know if it was lake water or tears. "You ever fished with a fly rod?" "No, just a cane pole. My dad has a Zebco fishing rod and reel." Father Paul explained that Zebco made good fishing equipment and that he owned several Zebco fishing reels. He showed Joe his split bamboo fly rod, saying it was his favorite. Joe had never seen a fly rod before. Father Paul then showed Joe the dry fly, explaining that he'd hand-tied the fly himself. Joe stated that he had only used worms. "Let me show you how we do this." Father Paul stripped out a piece of line with his left hand that made the reel creak. He flipped out the fishing line a short distance with his right hand. Father Paul stripped more line from the reel and flipped out the line again. He then repeated this by pulling more line from the creaky reel and made a cast, and the dry fly fell onto the water. That's what they call a roll cast. It's a simple cast you use in tight areas, or when you are fishing a short distance from shore, like this here. Joe looked on and was impressed by Father Paul and the smooth casts he made. He knew he'd like to try to do that. Father Paul began asking Joe questions in his broken English. "How is your teacher, Miss Smith? She hasn't been to Mass lately. Is Miss Smith feeling all right?" Hattie had confessed to Father Paul about her sexual interludes with Matt Savage. Joe had to be careful here. "Yes, but she's been sick in the mornings. After she drinks a Coca-Cola and smokes a cigarette, she's usually fine." Joe knew he needed to change the subject. "Did you and your dad go fishing much?" Father Paul made a mental note of Joe's comment about Miss Smith and threw another roll cast. The fly fell flat on top of the water. "Oh yes, but there wasn't much to do but take hikes and fish. How about you and your dad? Is your dad a fisherman?" "Not so much. Dad keeps telling me we'll go fishing, but he works a lot. He's a cattle investigator and we also raise cattle." "Yes, I know," Father Paul replied. "Your father has an important job." Joe also explained that his godfather was a great fisherman. His Uncle Tom had a marina on Johnson Lake near Elwood, where he and his Aunt Connie lived. "Mom has taken me fishing a few times and she's pretty good, but she's kind of busy too." "Yes, your mother works hard as well. You went fishing where you were from?" "Yes, back in Slovakia. I often fished. I lived in a town, not in the country as you do. But there was a river that went through the town." "Did you always want to be a priest?" "Yes and no. First I wanted to be a baker or a chef like your mother. Times were challenging because of the war. I always enjoyed it when people smiled while eating and drinking at cafes and restaurants. I decided to be a priest and am pleased that I did. Do you think I'm a good priest?" "My mom and dad like you, and the altar boys all like you." There was a significant pause. Joe looked off to the side and rubbed his wet head. "Is everything okay, Joseph? I forgot to mention something when I went to confession before Easter. I mean, I don't know if something is a sin or not." "I see. Would you like to ask me now?" "But we're not in the box." "You mean the confessional?" "Yes, the confessional box. That is ideal. But you can say your confession with a priest anywhere. The box, as you call it, is a reminder to go to confession and a private place in the church to tell the priest your sins." "It's okay. We can do it here if you'd like." Joe bowed his head and crossed himself. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." It has been about 2 weeks since my last confession. Father Paul asked Joe to take a breath and say what was troubling him when he was ready. Joe could hear frogs croaking in the background, and a small dragonfly flew around his head. Joe mentioned that he had said a couple of swear words when a cow bumped him off his feet, and when he hit his finger while nailing a staple into a fence post. And then he paused. "So, is there something else troubling you? Something you felt uncomfortable speaking about the last time you went to confession?" Joe paused again and took a deep breath. He kept his eyes down, staring at the ground. "There's a couple of things. Last year, and I'm not sure if this is a sin, but you see, I kissed one or both of the O'Connor twins. They kissed me on the lips. I mean, one of them kissed me on the lips. You see, each of the sisters has a green eye and a blue eye. And the one that kissed me first, I thought that her right eye was blue, and her left eye was green. Then the next day, I got kissed on the lips again, and I think her right eye was green, and her left eye was blue. I either got kissed by one girl 2 times or by each girl 1 time, but the kisses were different. You see, I got a backwards disease, so I sometimes turn things around." Father Paul watched Joe staring at the ground with a red face. "I see. Let me think for a bit. Is there anything else? First, what is this backward disease you mentioned?" "Yes, that's what my dad calls it. I turn things around sometimes. I mean, I turn numbers and letters around and get kind of confused about my directions." "I see. Is there anything else you'd like to confess?" Father Paul could tell that Joe had something else to say to him. His experience was that penitence saved the worst sin for last. "Is it a sin if you don't say something?" "Yes. It's possible that not saying or doing something is a sin. Is there someone hurting you?" "No." "Are you doing something bad to someone else?" "No." "I see. I don't know how to help unless you tell me what it is." Joe took a deep breath. "Miss Smith, my teacher, she left on Ash Wednesday." "What do you mean she left?" "She left me a note that she was going to quit being a teacher at my school and was moving to Colorado to be with her sister. She asked me to tell my parents and show them the notes she left, but I never did." Father Paul paused. "So I know you are the only student at your school. You've been going to school alone then?" "Yes, Father." "What? How do you?" It's like this, I've been following along in Miss Smith's class calendar and sort of doing the lessons myself. And you haven't told your parents about this? No. And these are all my sins. Joe said this quickly, hoping they would move on to the penance portion of the confession. Father Paul took a long pause. He saw Joe peek at him to gauge his reaction. Let's start with the bad language. He told Joe that swearing was a bad habit and a bad reflection of yourself. Father Paul also spoke of the girl kissing and talked about how it was normal for kids to have such feelings. He advised Joe to stay away from kissing girls until he was older. Now, let's talk about Miss Smith and your situation at school. Father Paul informed Joe that he was responsible for telling his parents about Miss Smith's departure. You know, as a priest, I cannot break the seal of the confessional and tell your parents what you have told me. Joe took a deep breath on learning that Father Paul would be keeping this secret between the two of them. But I hope you will tell your parents about your situation. They have a right to know. Joe thought for a while. Would it be okay if I waited until the end of the school year? I've made it this long and it's just a couple of weeks away. So you plan to tell your parents everything? When the school year is over? Yes. Well, I hope you would consider telling your parents sooner. You should pray about this, Joseph. You are to say 1, Our Father, 1, Hail Mary, and 1, Glory be for your penance. Do you know your prayers? Yes, Father Ditchke. Father Paul bowed. Say the act of contrition prayer. Joe said the prayer. Father Paul was giving Joe the final blessing when the fly rod bent. Joe grabbed the fly rod before it slid into the water and righted himself. Joe cranked on the reel as Father Paul instructed, and he pulled a bluegill to shore. Joe unhooked the fly from the fish and placed the fish in Father's wicker creel. If you go up to my car, I have a cooler with soda and cookies. Joe ran to Father's car and grabbed the cooler with Dr. Pepper's and the pinwheel cookies. Father explained that the cookies' dark and light swirl resulted from using vanilla and chocolate dough. He made them from a recipe he found in the St. John's cookbook, or maybe it was one of his mother's old recipes. Father Paul said that his mother would always make a snack for him and his sisters after they went to confession. While the two ate all the cookies and each drank a soda, they caught a total of 5 fish, one right after the other. Father Paul showed Joe how to operate the fly rod, and Joe was soon performing simple roll casts as the bluegill spawned and blooped near shore. While loading Father Paul's car, they watched a car drive past the lake. Looks like Mr. Hadjic, said Joe, pointing at the car. Father Paul's face became dark and serious, and he put his hand on Joe's shoulder. Promise me, Joseph, you will never get in Mr. Hadjic's vehicle or go to his house. Why? Joseph, if he ever asks you to ride with him, you tell him this, leave me alone, you dirty old skunk. And then you run. Never, never take a ride from him or go to his home without your mother or father. You promise me? Joe could tell the priest was upset. Yes, Father. Father Paul had heard the confession of Loretta Hadjic after giving her last rites before she died. Loretta told him she knew that her husband Carl had molested their 2 children, and she was afraid that he molested other children as well. Father Paul had heard similar stories, including stories of priests in the Catholic Church who sexually abused young children. He thought that these men were not priests, they were animals. Father Paul knew that he could kill another man with his bare hands if it meant protecting a child. Joe looked at the priest. He remembered his last meeting with Mr. Hadjic and the tattoo under his arm. Did you know he has an A tattooed under his arm? What? Father Paul stared at Joe. Did you say he has a tattoo under his right arm? Again, what kind of tattoo? It's the letter A. The letter A, are you sure? Yes, I saw it when he stopped off at school. A letter, A, under his arm. I saw it when he waved at Mrs. Walters when she drove by. Father Paul knew that Nazis tattooed their SS soldiers with such tattoos. The letter A was the soldier's blood type. You told me your confession, Joseph. Now I will tell you something about me. Father Paul placed the fly rod, creel, and cooler into the back seat. The priest rested against his car, saying, "But you must promise you will keep this between us, okay?" Joe nodded his head and said that he would keep the secret. When I was a young priest, the Nazis came to my room one night. Nazis were bad soldiers. Have you heard of the Nazis? Yes, I read about the Nazis in my history book. The Nazis were looking for another priest who was a friend of mine. I wouldn't tell them where he was, and they, Father Paul paused as he thought this might be too much to tell a young boy, but he continued. They beat me, and they kept beating me, and I still didn't talk. Then they cut my tongue. That's why I talk somewhat oddly. Well, that and my Slovakian accent. Father Paul paused again and looked out over the lake. They were evil men, and I tell you this, Joseph, so you know that evil does exist in our world. Mr. Hajek is an evil man. People think there's no danger here because of where we live. But there is danger here, Joseph. There are people here who might hurt you. It is important to be safe and keep a watchful eye. Father Paul took a big breath and said he needed to return to the rectory. Would you like a ride home, Joseph? Joe thought of the mini bike he had hidden in the weeds. It's okay, Father. I can walk home. I like to walk. Are you sure? Your place is 2.5 miles from here? Yes, I'm sure. I like to walk. Okay. I was a walker too when I was your age. Have a good day and thanks for fishing with me. It looks like I have enough for a good supper. You brought me good luck. And remember, Joseph, Jesus and his mother love you very much. Thank you, Father. Joe returned the sweater and watched Father Paul drive off in his car. Joe doubled back and retrieved the mini bike. He knew he needed to wait for Father Paul to get home before he drove by the church on his way back to the school. Joe waited by the lake, taking in all that had happened, his near drowning, and his confession, and Father Paul's confession of being beaten by the Nazis, and how he'd learned to use the fly rod. Joe started the mini bike and drove back to the road and past the church. He didn't think Father Paul saw him, but Father Paul had stopped to water the rose bushes near the rectory and saw Joseph drive by on the mini bike. Father Paul smiled, but then he thought of Joe's story and the A tattoo under Mr. Hajek's right arm. Something needed to be done about Herr Hajek. Joe rode the mini bike back to school, his clothes drying in the breeze. He said his penance prayers as Father Paul had asked. He again avoided meeting anyone on the road. Joe guided the bike into the pole barn and covered the bike with the canvas tarp. Joe lowered the flag from the flagpole. He returned to the school, shut off the lights, and closed and locked the door, but left the key in the lock. It was almost 4 o'clock, and Joe's parents would be home soon. Joe ran the 3/4 of a mile to the Bauer farm. He dressed, put on his chore boots, and went outside. Joe's mother returned home, but Joe had already made it out to check on the cows before she made it to the house. Joe pitched hay to the cows, thinking about what Father Paul told him. Not telling his parents was a lie, and Father Paul had said so. Joe knew he had little time left before he'd have to confess to his parents. Fish story number 5. From the novel Sandhill's Sojourn, Mermaid. Joe Bauer spent his 16th summer in 1980 at his great-uncle's cattle ranch. His parents felt a job in the Nebraska Sandhills would be a good experience for their only child. It turned out to be a great experience, except for the 3 occasions when he almost died. Vast rolling plains sit atop the Ogallala Aquifer in north-central Nebraska. The underground sea of water lies below the mixed grass prairie, painting the sand dunes. Joe's uncle, Reuben Bauer, would say, "These hills used to sit at the bottom of an ocean that came after glaciers slid out onto the Great Plains thousands of years ago." He'd tell people with his easy smile, "It's a great way of life if you can afford it." Added, "I'm really working for my banker." Joe's parents lived in Ewing, 130 miles east of the Cherry County Ranch. His mother, Susan, was a high school teacher, and his father, Jim, was an investigator for the Nebraska Cattle Brand Commission. Knowing his uncle and aunt needed the help, his father arranged for Joe's summer job. His son had helped the relatives put up hay for a few weeks the year before, but this year, he'd be there all summer. On a breezy late afternoon in May, Jim dropped Joe off at the ranch, finding that Reuben and Hallie were not home. Lucky, the Australian cattle dog, sniffed the boy and recognized him from previous visits. White sheets dried on the clothesline as a sprinkler watered the garden. Reuben's pickup was gone, but Jim guessed they were close by. Joe found his room and settled in. They left canned jelly and pickles made by Joe's mother on the kitchen table. Before departing for a case in Hyannis, Jim Bauer handed his son a Polaroid camera and a coffee can with stones and said, "Be of good help to your aunt and uncle. And remember what Sophocles said, 'Without labor, nothing prospers.'" He added, "Behave yourself this summer, Joseph." A horse whinnied in the corral as Joe watched his father drive off, leaving him in the sandhills without a vehicle for the rest of the summer. He wished for a car of his own, at least he had a driver's license. Joe rode the horse beans to Cove Lake. He left a note on the kitchen table, next to the jelly and pickles, letting Hallie and Reuben know of his arrival. Lucky followed along. The saddle leather squeaked while he rode through the maternity pasture. He watched the young calves sleep and nurse their mothers. Reuben would help a group of neighbors with their yearly branding of the new calves, and they in turn would help him. That was life in the sandhills. Reuben's cow herd had dwindled. An investor from Iowa now rented part of his ranch, which had a small home his uncle called the bunkhouse. The Iowan parked his bush plane and a new Ford pickup there. He also pastured cows and calves at a second ranch near Valentine. A rich boy midlife crisis led him to a cowboy phase. Emerging from their winter funk, the aroma of the prairie grasses and flowers filled the air. Big blue stem, little blue stem, love grass, hairy grama, blue grama, switchgrass, and Indian grass emerged next to prickly poppy, hairy puccoon, and prairie rose flowers. More flowers like the sunflower, yucca, prickly pear, and field snake cotton would come during the summer. Wild begonias were Haley's favorite. The whole area smelled fresh, the typical smell after a quiet rain. The vast azure sky stole his breath as the horse plodded along. The sun's warmth softened the spring breeze, and Cove Lake came to life. Birds flitted about, chattering and chirping as a knot of toads and an army of bullfrogs creaked and croaked. He felt the 3 skipping stones he'd grabbed from the coffee can. The ranch had no good stones, so he brought some along. Joe stepped down and pulled off his sweatshirt, pocketing the stones and a harmonica in his jeans. He hung his sweatshirt on the saddle horn and shouldered the strap of the Polaroid camera. The dappled gray horse drank lake water and grazed on nearby nubs of new grass. Blackbirds chirped wildly among the water, willow and lizards tail hugging the lake shore and shallows. A blue heron stood on the lookout and let loose its wicked cry. Reuben said the heron's shriek sounded like a banshee, but Joe didn't know what a banshee was. Lucky nervously ran up and down the lake's shoreline, sniffing at a track in the sand. "What's going on, dog? What are you smelling?" Joe bent over and looked down at paw prints, which he guessed were left by a coyote. He felt the canine impressions with his fingers. They were far bigger than Lucky's prints on the wet sand. He must be a big one, Lucky. A really big one. Joe sat on the log of an old cottonwood near the lake and petted the dog. Reuben had tacked a star he made from a piece of corrugated tin to the log, Hallie's idea. Large cottonwood trees with bark resembling alligator skin creaked with each gust of wind. Joe wondered about the age of the tall trees now shedding. He caught their white fluff gliding like stringy snowflakes in the breeze. A sedge of sandhill cranes took flight from the lake and joined a flock flying overhead on their late spring migration to the nesting grounds in Canada. Their manic chirrups sounded as if something fierce was chasing after them. He took the 3 stones from his pocket and sidearmed them on top of the lake, trying to make them skip, but none did. A perfect stone in the can was saved for later. A red cardinal rested on a tall cattail. Joe's mother would say, "Cardinals appear when angels are near." Reuben would say, "The cardinal is a holy messenger, a foreshadowing that good would defeat evil." Strong words from a man who didn't attend church. He photographed the red bird with the Polaroid and set the photo on the log to dry. He ate the Braunschweiger sandwich and the chocolate chip cookies he'd taken from his aunt's kitchen, storing the food in an empty bread sack. Lucky leaped and caught Braunschweiger. The boy tossed in the air. The dog looked on for more. After helping at the ranch the year before, Hallie gave Joe an old harmonica. He started to suck and blow, making a sound that barely resembled music. As Joe blew on the instrument, a bird flew in and landed near the shoreline. At first glance, he thought the bird was a mourning dove, then noticed its white and gray wings and yellow bill. The bird had a scar on its back. Joe spoke to the bird. "I remember seeing you last year. Uncle said you're a seagull." Reuben relayed that Hallie had found the bird after it had been injured. She nursed it back to life. Since then, the scarred gull has returned to the lake every year. Joe tossed a piece of bread from his sandwich. The bird hopped over, grabbed the bread with its beak and swallowed. The gull then began mewing. Joe snapped a Polaroid, set the photo to dry next to the cardinal picture, and hung the camera on the saddle horn with the sweatshirt. Reuben had told Joe not to fish or swim in Cove Lake, You can swim and fish at Opossum Lake. It's full of bluegill and perch. But no fishing or swimming in Cove Lake. That didn't include the carp, Reuben trapped in the shallows as he tried to rid the lake of the nuisance fish. He thought of swimming, but his mother forbade him from swimming alone. Joe's mother often worried about her only child. But Joe loved to swim. He'd be careful. Almost drowning when he was 12 led him to become a strong swimmer. His mother didn't know about his near drowning, but what his mother didn't know wouldn't upset her. And how would she ever know? Maybe just a quick dip in the water. Joe removed his cowboy boots and clothes, hanging them over the log. The cold water shocked his feet, but Joe thought he'd be quick about it. After telling Lucky to stay, he dived in. The bird continued to screech and bounce. Joe side-stroked away from the shoreline, took a deep breath, filling his young lungs with oxygen, and then dove below the water. He propelled himself through the foggy haze of the Sandhills Lake. The coldness faded with each downward stroke of his arms and kick of his legs. Minnows and bullheads and green sunfish darted away from him. Snapping turtles were a concern. Before running out of air, Joe prepared to turn his body and propel himself back off the lake floor. Then he saw something. A gleaming white object with an extended L shape sat on the lake's sandy bottom. It looked to be the skeleton of a large fish. Joe took hold of it, guessing it was a bone. As he pushed himself back up, his foot became entangled in a jumble of barbed wire. He yanked his leg, but the wire dug in, and the pain caused him to gasp and expel the rest of his air. Feeling woozy, Joe struggled to undo the wire. Then he saw movement as he gulped water in search of air. He felt arms take hold of him and push him to shore as he heaved and gagged. As he lay there, coughing and spitting, Joe sucked in the Sandhills air. His heart beat like a drum in his chest. Streams of water ran off his body while he shook violently. Joe stood on wobbly legs and coughed up more water as he caught his breath. Lucky barked warily and looked out over the water with ears perked and hair on end. The bird repeated whoa-whoa chants, as if it were upset with him. Joe's shaking hand still held the L-shaped bone from the bottom of the lake. The raucous blackbird's chattering went quiet as Joe's heavy breathing filled the silence. Joe looked around but saw no one. White fluff from the cottonwood trees drifted over the water. After returning to the home place, the dog lay in the shade of the barn. Joe unsaddled his horse and hid the bone taken from the lake in the barn's hayloft, recognizing it as a jawbone. Joe watched a barn swallow make a mud nest in the rafters and decided not to tell his aunt and uncle what happened. They'd be upset with him for swimming in the lake, and they might tell his mother. He remembered he left the Polaroid pictures of the birds on the log. The two hadn't returned home when Joe climbed the steps to his room. While drying his hair with a towel, his body shook. The red cuts on his leg and foot looked terrible. Finding peroxide in the bathroom, he poured it over the stinging wounds, covered them with Band-Aids, and flushed the Band-Aid wrappers down the toilet. He then lay down on his bed and fell asleep. Joe woke later to find his uncle at the kitchen table reviewing receipts as he updated the ranch's business ledger. Reuben said Hallie had gone to bed early. She left him a supper of meatloaf and mashed potatoes warming in the oven. There was also cherry pie on the table and ice cream in the Frigidaire. Reuben said they thought he was to come the following day and asked the ashen-faced boy if he felt okay. Joe didn't mention almost drowning in the lake, nor anything about being rescued. He told Reuben, "I saw a huge paw print at Cove Lake. I also saw that the seagull with the scar is back again this year." At night, Reuben would often read to Hallie. She'd loosen her rust-colored curls from its bun, close her eyes, and listen to her husband read novels or from a set of encyclopedias. On Sundays, he read her the Bible she had brought from her home in Maine, which had small fingerprint impressions on the cover. Hallie could not speak or read. She used her own unique sign language to communicate with her husband. The couple, who had no television, often listened to music on a close-and-play stereo. While Reuben slept in his chair, Joe searched the set of alphabetized encyclopedias. His dyslexia caused him to write and read his numbers and letters backward or upside down. Joe first searched under the W's before searching under the M's. The book depicted a mermaid as a woman with a fin growing from her waist, webbed hands, long hair, and breasts. Joe recalled gliding to shore, much like when he almost drowned when he was 12. At that time, an older priest saved his life. He was unsure who saved him this time. For whatever reason, he felt it to be a strong female entity like his mother. The encyclopedia spelled out how the fictional she-fish kept items in their den at the bottom of the sea. They valued a hairbrush the most. He thought of the bone with teeth, the jawbone of a cow maybe. But Joe had never seen the jawbone of a rhinoceros before. Reuben snored and readjusted himself in his chair. Joe glanced at a wooden frame holding a quilt displaying hand-painted blocks of American flags, a work in progress. He also noticed a Bible and several books about birds in the bookcase. Joe read that a mermaid would respond to music. Maybe his harmonica caught her attention. That mermaid saved my life. He shook his head and thought, "What the hell are you thinking, idiot? There's no such thing as mermaids." The end.
This is some sample text.